The customer flinch. I've had enough. How many times do I have to tell you to be careful? Do you even care about this place? Ruth froze. Her hands were shaking as she held the now empty tray. She wanted to explain, to tell him that her mind had been on her sick son, that she was trying her best, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was look down, ashamed and embarrassed. The diner felt colder somehow, the warm smell of coffee turning sharp, almost bitter. Other employees stopped what they were doing. A few customers glanced over, their expressions a mixture of concern and discomfort. Silence fell like a heavy blanket over the room. Thomas, still fuming, took a deep breath, trying to regain some control. That's it, he shouted, his voice shaking with frustration. You're fired. Get your things and leave. I don't want to see you here again. Ruth nodded slowly, swallowing hard. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply untied her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. Her eyes were wet, but her face held a quiet dignity that no amount of anger could break. For a brief moment, Thomas looked at her and felt nothing but annoyance. But deep down, there was a strange tug in his chest, something he didn't want to acknowledge. Ruth turned toward the door, her steps small and careful, like she was carrying an invisible weight. She paused for a moment before stepping out into the cold wind. Her last glance at Thomas was soft, almost forgiving, though he didn't notice it. And then she was gone, leaving the diner strangely empty. The customer at the corner table cleaned the spilled coffee silently, trying not to stare. Thomas returned behind the counter, breathing heavily. His anger still burned, but underneath it, a small uncomfortable feeling began to grow. Something about the way Ruth had left, calm and silent, made the room feel heavier, like a shadow had passed through. He tried to ignore it, tried to shove it away with the sound of the cash reg. He tried to continue the day, but her words wouldn't leave him. My son's in the hospital. He keeps asking if Mama will bring pancakes. That night he sat in his empty office, staring at Ruth's time card. He didn't know her life story. Didn't know she was raising a sick child alone. Part 5. The visit, 2 days later, Thomas found the courage to ask around and locate the hospital. He carried a box of Ruth's pancakes, fresh, warm, and topped with whipped cream, just like she used to make. When he entered the hospital room, Ruth's eyes would part 6, the change of heart. Thomas frowned, still breathing hard from anger. My son's in the hospital, she continued, her voice trembling. Leukemia. He keeps asking if Mama will bring pancakes from the diner he loves. I was just thinking about that when I dropped the cup. She smiled faintly, tears gathering in her eyes. Anyway, I hope business gets better for you. You've got a good heart, even if today's been rough. And then she walked out. Part 4. The silence. After, the diner was completely still. Even the coffee machine's hiss sounded like a whisper. Thomas's anger vanished, replaced by a heavy guilt pressing against his chest. Enid. Her son, a little boy with big brown eyes, smiled weakly. Mama, is that from the diner? Thomas swallowed hard and handed him the pancakes. These are on the house, champ, he said softly. Ooh, there, tears in her eyes. You didn't have to come, Mr. Thomas. I did, he said quietly. I was wrong, Ruth. I shouldn't have fired you. I wasn't angry at you. I was angry at life. She nodded, saying nothing, but the forgiveness in her eyes was enough to break him. A week later, Thomas put a sign outside the diner. Welcome back. Part 7. The lesson that stayed forever years later. People still remembered that diner, not for its food, but for its kindness. Thomas often told the story to new Part 5. The visit, 2 days later, Thomas found the courage to ask around and locate the hospital. He carried a box of Ruth's pancakes, fresh, warm, and topped with whipped cream, just like she used to make. When he entered the hospital room, Ruth's eyes would part 6, the change of heart. Ruth's it was a stormy Tuesday morning when Thomas, the owner of a small-town diner, lost his temper. Business had been bad, bills were. The other employees looked away, uncomfortable. No one spoke up. Ruth turned to leave, but before she reached the door, she stopped. Part 3. Her last words piling up, and every little thing felt like too much. The waitress, a quiet black woman named Ruth, accidentally spilled coffee on a customer's table. Thomas snapped, "Enough," he shouted in front of everyone. "You're done here, Ruth. Go home. You're fired." The diner went silent. Ruth froze, her hands trembling as she clutched her apron. Part 2, the quiet pain. Ruth didn't argue. She didn't cry or defend herself. She just nodded slowly, untied her apron and placed it gently on the counter. Her eyes were tired in a way that went beyond that morning's mistake. She turned back and said softly, "Mr. Thomas, I understand. You've had a hard week. I'm sorry for the spill. I was just thinking about my boy." Thomas frowned, still breathing hard from anger. "My son's in the hospital," she continued, her voice trembling. "Leukemia. He keeps asking if Mama will bring pancakes from the diner he loves." "I was just thinking about that when I dropped the cup." She smiled faintly, tears gathering in her eyes. "Anyway, I hope business gets better for you. You've got a good heart, even if today's been rough." And then she walked out. Part 4, the silence. After, the diner was completely still. Even the coffee machine's hiss sounded like a whisper. Thomas's anger vanished, replaced by a heavy guilt pressing against his chest. Enid. Her son, a little boy with big brown eyes, smiled weakly. "Mama, is that from the diner?" Thomas swallowed hard and handed him the pancakes. "These are on the house, champ," he said softly. Ood there, tears in her eyes. "You didn't have to come, Mr. Thomas." "I did," he said quietly. "I was wrong, Ruth. I shouldn't have fired you. I wasn't angry at you. I was angry at life." She nodded, saying nothing, but the forgiveness in her eyes was enough to break him. A week later, Thomas put a sign outside the diner. "Welcome back." Part 7, the lesson that stayed forever years later. People still remembered that diner, not for its food, but for its kindness. Thomas often told the story to new employees. "Everyone has a story," he'd say. "Be gentle. You never know what battle someone's fighting." Ruth's son recovered. Ruth became the diner's manager. And Thomas? He never shouted in anger again, Thomas's anger. Her thoughts were on her son, Michael, lying in the hospital bed she had left that morning. He was only 7, but he fought a battle no child should face: leukemia. She had spent the night holding his hand, watching his breathing, listening to the beeping of monitors, praying that the doctors were right when they said the treatment was working. Ruth felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had learned to be strong for him, to hide her pain so he would not feel more fear than necessary. She had spent years carrying burdens quietly, never asking for help, never complaining. Today, though, even she felt exhausted, a bone-deep tiredness that made every breath feel heavy. She knew the diner job was her lifeline, her way to pay bills, buy his medicine, and somehow keep life moving forward. Losing it was not just about the work. It felt like losing her anchor in an already stormy sea. Back in the diner, Thomas tried to focus on the morning rush, but he found himself distracted. Every time a cup rattled on a saucer, or a customer called for more coffee, his mind drifted back to Ruth. He thought of the way her hands had trembled, the faint but steady dignity in her expression, and the strange, quiet strength that she carried without a word. He felt a flicker of guilt, but quickly tried to push it away. He was the boss. He had made a decision. That was the way life worked. But the feeling would not go away. It grew slowly, a soft ache in his chest that he could not ignore. Ruth found a small park nearby and sat on a bench, watching the rain fall on the empty swings and puddles forming on the concrete paths. She wondered how she would tell Michael she had been fired, how she would manage the bills, the medicine, the hospital visits. Her heart felt heavy, but she breathed deeply, trying to steady herself. She had to be strong for him, for herself. Tears ran down her cheeks, but she did not cry out. She simply let the rain wash over her, mixing with her quiet sorrow. She remembered Thomas yelling, remembered the anger in his voice, but she did not hate him. She had worked for him for years and had seen kindness beneath the rough exterior. She believed that somewhere inside, Thomas had a good heart, even if he had lost control that morning. Her son's needs came first, but she also knew that anger and mistakes were part of life. Still, the sting of humiliation and fear of losing stability lingered, a quiet, persistent ache. Hours passed. Ruth eventually stood up and walked slowly toward the hospital. She needed to see Michael, to hold him, to remind herself and him that love existed even in the darkest moments. And as she walked, she whispered softly to herself, "I'll manage. Somehow I'll get through this." Her steps were slow, heavy, but determined, carrying the weight of a mother's endless love. The sting of humiliation and fear of losing stability lingered, a quiet, persistent ache. Hours passed. Ruth eventually stood up and walked slowly toward the hospital. She needed to see Michael, to hold him, to remind herself and him that love existed even in the darkest moments. And as she walked, she whispered softly to herself, "I'll manage. Somehow I'll get through this." Her steps were slow, heavy but determined, carrying the weight of a mother's endless love. Meanwhile, back in the diner, Thomas cleaned tables mechanically, his hands moving but his mind elsewhere. He replayed the scene over and over. Ruth's calm acceptance, the gentle look in her eyes, the way she had not begged or argued. Something about it gnawed at him. His anger had vanished almost immediately, replaced by a hollow, uneasy feeling. He realized that he had fired not just a worker, but a person with a life, struggles, and burdens he knew nothing about. That evening, Thomas sat alone behind the counter, staring at the empty chairs. The sun had disappeared, leaving the diner in shadows. He remembered Ruth's eyes, her quiet strength, and her grace under pressure. For the first time that day, he readily. "Do you know why I was distracted this morning?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas shook his head. "It's my son, Michael. He's in the hospital. He has leukemia. I stayed up all night with him. I was thinking about how he loves the pancakes from this diner, how he asks me every morning if I can bring them to him when he can't eat properly. That's why my hands shook. That's why the coffee spilled." She paused, looking down at her folded hands. Thomas felt something in his chest tighten painfully. The anger, the irritation. It all seemed meaningless now, replaced by an overwhelming sense of shame and helplessness. Ruth's voice grew even softer, carrying the weight of a life Thomas had never known. "I didn't want to disappoint him. I didn't want to lose my job, but I was more worried about him. He's all I have, Mr. Thomas. He's my world." Thomas wanted to speak, to apologize, to somehow take back his words, but nothing came out. Her calm, quiet dignity was like a mirror reflecting his own mistakes back at him. He realized with a gut-wrenching clarity that he had judged her without knowing her story. Then she did something Thomas would never forget. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a strange combination of sorrow and forgiveness, and she smiled faintly. "I hope things get better for you too. I hope the diner thrives. You have a good heart even when you forget it." She turned toward the door slowly, her shoulders squared despite the heaviness she carried. Thomas wanted to call her back, to beg her to stay, but the words caught in his throat. She paused for a heartbeat just inside the doorway and added softly, "Please, remember that everyone has battles you cannot see." And then she was gone. Thomas stood frozen behind the counter, staring at the empty doorway. The room felt colder, emptier, and yet heavier with meaning. Her words reverberated in his mind, sinking deep into his chest. He felt a mixture of guilt, sorrow, and awe, as though a veil had been lifted, revealing a life, a struggle, and a courage he had never known existed. For hours he couldn't focus on anything. The spilled coffee, the shouting, the anger, all of it seemed insignificant now. Ruth had reminded him in just a few quiet sentences of something far greater than mistakes or rules, the fragile, precious weight of life, love, and humanity. Outside, the sky was still gray, but inside Thomas's heart something had shifted. A small, fragile seed of understanding had been planted, a seed that would grow into regret, compassion, and perhaps the desire to make things right. He would never hear Ruth's words again without remembering them, without feeling the ache of what he had almost lost. And deep down he knew that his life and the diner would never be the same again. After Ruth left, the diner felt different. The usual chatter, the clinking of cutlery, and the hum of conversation no longer filled the room. Everything seemed quieter, almost as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Thomas stood behind the counter, staring at the empty doorway through which Ruth had walked. He could still see her just for a moment. In his mind, her calm expression, her small, forgiving smile, and the way she had carried herself despite everything. He tried to move on, to focus on the morning rush, but it was impossible. Every time he washed a dish, wiped a counter, or called out to a customer, her words echoed in his mind. Everyone has battles you cannot see. He couldn't get them out of his head. His chest ached with a mixture of guilt and shame, a heavy. The thought of Michael, her sick little boy, hit him harder than anything else. He pictured the small hospital room, the tiny bed, the beeping machines, and Ruth sitting by his side, exhausted and worried. The coffee spill, the shouting, the anger. It all felt insignificant, almost meaningless compared to the life Ruth was trying to protect. Thomas's heart twisted. He wanted to undo what he had done, to take back the words, the anger, the dismissal, but he knew that was impossible. He cleaned tables mechanically, moving through the motions but seeing nothing. Every plate he stacked, every glass he wiped reminded him of Ruth's quiet dignity. How had he been so blind? How had he failed to see her courage, her strength, and her humanity? The questions gnawed at him, leaving a hollow ache in his chest. The customers came and went, chatting, laughing, leaving tips, and yet Thomas noticed none of it. His mind was elsewhere, replaying her words over and over. Everyone has battles you cannot see. He thought of all the times he had shouted at his employees, judged their mistakes, and forgotten to see the person behind the error. A wave of regret washed over him, sharp and unrelenting. Hours passed, but Thomas could not shake the feeling. He tried to focus on the bills, on the business, on keeping the diner running, but his thoughts kept returning to Ruth and her son. He realized how little he had known about the people around him, how easily he had judged, how quickly he had let anger take control. It was a painful lesson, one he would not forget. By evening, the diner was empty. Thomas sat behind the counter, staring at the folded apron Ruth had left on the counter. The simple piece of cloth now felt like a symbol, a reminder of humility, grace, and the weight of unseen struggles. He felt a lump in his throat and a tear form in his eye, but he did not wipe it away. He knew he deserved this pain, this guilt, as a lesson for the anger he had shown. Outside, the sky had turned dark, and rain began to fall again. Thomas watched through the window as droplets traced paths down the glass, mirroring the tears he did not try to hide. The storm outside felt like a reflection of the storm within him, chaotic and relentless, but slowly, beneath the guilt, a small seed of understanding began to grow. For the first time in years, Thomas questioned not just his anger but himself. He realized he had been blind, harsh, and impatient. He realized that true leadership, true humanity, meant seeing the struggles of others, understanding their pain, and showing compassion even in difficult moments. He had failed Ruth, and he could not undo it, but he could learn. He could change. And as he sat alone in the quiet diner, the weight of the day pressing on him, Thomas made a silent promise. He would never look at another person the same way again. He would never forget Ruth's words, her story, or the lesson she had unknowingly given him. Something inside him had shifted, fragile but real. A beginning, a chance to be better, to see deeper, and to honor the quiet battles that others fought every day. Thomas could not sleep that night. The diner was closed, dark and quiet, but his mind was wide awake, haunted by Ruth's words and the image of her small, weary smile. He kept thinking about her son, Michael, lying in a hospital bed waiting for his mother, trusting her to protect him. The thought twisted his heart with guilt and urgency. How could he have been so blind? How could he have treated someone like Ruth, someone carrying so much pain so harshly? By morning, Thomas had made a decision. He could not undo the past, he could not take back his anger, but he could do something now. He grabbed a box, filled it with fresh pancakes, Ruth's favorite style, and wrapped it carefully. Each one was made to perfection, fluffy and warm, topped with a little butter and syrup. It was a small gesture, but Thomas hoped it would carry more than just food. It would carry understanding, regret, and perhaps a hint of comfort. He asked around quietly and found the address of the hospital where Michael was staying. His hands shook as he drove, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Every thought of Ruth, every whispered word she had left him with, played in his mind like a song he could not escape. He rehearsed what he would say, knowing that words might fail him when he finally stood before her. When he arrived, the hospital was quiet, almost peaceful compared to the storm that raged inside him. He walked through the hallways, the smell of antiseptic sharp in his nose, until he reached Michael's room. He paused at the door, peeking in, and froze. There was Ruth sitting in a chair next to a small hospital bed. Michael lay under a thin blanket, his pale face turned toward the window, his tiny hands curled over the sheets. He looked weak, fragile, but still alive, still fighting, still full of hope. Ruth's eyes lifted as she noticed Thomas. For a moment she seemed surprised, wary, and cautious, but she did not move away. Thomas stepped into the room, holding the box carefully. I brought something, he said softly, his voice low, almost breaking. He set the box on the small table next to the bed and opened it, revealing the warm pancakes. Michael's eyes widened instantly, a small smile forming on his lips despite his weakness. "Mom, is that from the diner?" he asked, his voice weak but filled with wonder. Ruth looked at Thomas, a mixture of surprise and uncertainty in her eyes. "You didn't have to come, Mr. Thomas," she said softly. "I did," he said, his voice trembling. "I was wrong. I shouldn't have fired you yesterday. I wasn't angry at you, I was angry at life. I didn't see what you were carrying. I didn't understand your story. I want to make it right in some small way." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but she did not speak. She simply nodded, looking at Thomas in a way that was both cautious and grateful. Michael reached for a pancake, his small fingers brushing the warm stack, and Ruth gently held his hand. You didn't have to do this," she whispered finally. "I wanted to," Thomas replied quietly, almost ashamed. "I can't take back my anger, but maybe I can be better. For you, for him, for everyone I judged too quickly." Michael took a bite of the pancake, his eyes lighting up despite his illness. He looked at Thomas and smiled, weak but genuine. Thomas felt a lump in his throat, the weight of guilt and relief and hope all mixing together. For the first time since firing Ruth, he felt he could breathe again. Ruth reached over and squeezed Thomas's hand lightly. There was no need for words. Her forgiveness, though silent, was there. It was gentle, quiet, and powerful, more than he deserved, but he accepted it, knowing that this moment, this small act of kindness, had already begun to heal something broken inside him. And in that small hospital room, with pancakes between them and hope in the air, Thomas realized something he would never forget. Sometimes, the smallest gestures, the quietest words, and the simplest understanding could change lives, even in the darkest moments. After that visit to the hospital, Thomas felt different. Something inside him had shifted in a way he had never experienced before. He could still see Michael's small face, pale but smiling, and Ruth's quiet dignity in his mind. The weight of his anger from the diner seemed lighter now, replaced by a strange, deep warmth that filled the spaces where guilt and regret had lived. He realized that one small act of kindness could ripple into something bigger than he had imagined. Back at the diner, Thomas walked through the empty tables slowly. The morning rush had passed and the room was silent, filled only with the soft hum of the coffee machine. He glanced at the counter where Ruth's apron had once lain and felt a pang of longing, not just for her presence, but for the reminder of what it meant to see people as human beings, not just employees. He knew he had failed her before, but now he wanted to do better. He wanted to see beyond mistakes, beyond spilled coffee, and into the heart of the person standing in front of him. Over the next few days, Thomas found himself thinking constantly about Ruth and Michael. He couldn't stop imagining Michael's laughter, even if faint and weak, or Ruth's quiet strength as she cared for her son. He realized that life was fragile, that people carried burdens he would never understand unless he paused, listened, and acted with compassion. He understood for the first time that leadership wasn't about rules or anger. It was about empathy, understanding, and kindness. Unable to keep it to himself any longer, Thomas made a decision. He wanted Ruth back at the diner, not just as a waitress, but as someone he trusted, someone he could learn from, someone who reminded him what truly mattered. That afternoon, he drove to her apartment, carrying another small gift, a handwritten note and a bouquet of flowers. He rang the doorbell, heart pounding, unsure how she would respond. When Ruth opened the door, she looked surprised to see him standing there. Her eyes, cautious at first, softened when she noticed the sincerity in his expression. "Mr. Thomas," she began, but he interrupted gently. "Please call me Thomas. I came because I was wrong. I let anger blind me and I forgot what's important. I want to make it right if you'll let me." Ruth studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for the truth. Finally, she nodded slowly. I don't know if I can forget what happened," she said quietly, "but I can see that you are trying, and that counts for something." Thomas smiled, relief flooding through him. "I don't expect forgiveness immediately. I want to do better. For you, for Michael, and for everyone who works here. Please come back to the diner. We need you. I need you." Ruth hesitated, then stepped aside. "I'll come back. On one condition, she said softly, a small smile forming, that we all remember why we work here and why kindness matters. Thomas nodded, tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. Agreed, that's all I ask. Over the next few weeks, Ruth returned to the diner, not just as an employee but as a guiding presence. Thomas watched her interact with the customers, the staff, and the small community that frequented the diner. He noticed how much patience she had, how much care she put into every task, and how her quiet strength inspired others without a single word. Slowly, Thomas began to change too. He no longer yelled at employees, no longer let anger control his decisions. He listened more, understood more, and acted with compassion. Michael's health improved gradually, and Thomas made a point to visit the hospital occasionally, bringing small treats or just sitting and talking with the boy. The bond that had begun with pancakes had grown into something much deeper: trust, respect, and mutual care. Thomas realized that sometimes life gives second chances, not just for redemption, but for transformation. And in that small diner, with Ruth smiling behind the counter and Michael's laughter echoing faintly in the town, Thomas understood something profound. The heart is capable of change, but only when it truly sees the humanity in others. He had been angry, blind, and harsh, but now he was learning to be gentle, patient, and kind. The lesson Ruth had taught him would remain with him forever. Months passed, and the small-town diner transformed into something more than just a place to eat. It became a place of warmth, understanding, and quiet kindness. Ruth worked behind the counter again, her presence calm but strong, guiding the staff with patience and care. Thomas watched her closely, noticing how she brought out the best in everyone. He had changed too. His anger was gone, replaced by empathy, patience, and a quiet confidence that came from truly seeing others. Michael's health slowly improved. The hospital visits became shorter, the treatments easier to manage, and his laughter, once faint and fragile, grew stronger. Every morning, Ruth made a small pancake for him, just the way he liked, and Thomas often delivered it personally when the diner's kitchen was busy. Those small moments, simple and ordinary, carried extraordinary weight. They reminded everyone that life was fragile, love was precious, and compassion mattered more than anything else. Thomas often reflected on that stormy morning when he had fired Ruth in anger. He remembered the spilled coffee, the shouting, and the silence that had followed. But he also remembered her last words, the words that had broken through his anger and guilt, reaching straight into his heart. Everyone has battles you cannot see. Those words became his mantra, a reminder that people were more than their mistakes, more than their appearances, more than the brief moments he might judge them by. He shared that lesson with everyone who walked through the diner. To new employees, he said, treat people with respect. See them, listen to them. You never know the battles they are fighting. To regular customers, he told the story quietly, never boasting, just sharing the truth that had changed him forever. And sometimes when the diner was empty and the rain tapped softly on the windows, Thomas would sit quietly, thinking of Ruth, Michael, and the way one simple act of courage and honesty had transformed all their lives. The town noticed the difference too. People began coming to the diner not just for food but for the warmth and kindness that radiated from it. They noticed how the staff smiled genuinely, how Thomas listened, how Ruth treated everyone with dignity and care. It became a place where hearts were lifted, not just stomachs. And it all started with a spilled cup of coffee, an outburst of anger, and the quiet courage of a woman who refused to be broken by circumstances. One evening, after the diner had closed, Thomas stood outside and watched the sun set over the small town. He thought of Ruth and Michael, of the struggles they had endured and the grace with which they had carried them. He felt gratitude, not just for their forgiveness, but for the lesson they had unknowingly given him. That kindness is never wasted, that understanding can heal, and that compassion can transform even the hardest hearts. Ruth's son, now laughing and playing, often came by the diner with his mother. Thomas watched them from the doorway sometimes, smiling quietly. Michael would wave and Thomas would wave back, feeling a warmth that he had never experienced before. He realized that life's most meaningful moments were not the ones spent in anger or pride, but the ones spent in humility, empathy, and love. And as the diner lights glowed softly in the evening, Thomas whispered to himself, I will never forget. I will never stop seeing. I will never stop caring. The words were a promise to Ruth, to Michael, and to himself. The anger of that morning had faded, replaced by understanding, gratitude, and a heart that had been transformed forever.